Some people call it healing, some call it awakening. And for many, it feels like something deeper. Like being carried, guided, or restored in a way that you couldn't have forced on your own. And when that lifting begins, when you start to rise into clarity, into truth, into a stronger sense of self, something else begins to happen at the same time. The narcissist in your life starts to lose their grip. Because when God lifts you up, the narcissist starts to fall. Not necessarily in a dramatic, visible collapse, but in the quiet unraveling of control. In the slow fading of influence. In the subtle but undeniable shift where you are no longer the same person they once relied on to maintain their power. For a long time, you may not have even realized how much of yourself you had given away. You thought you were being patient, loving, forgiving. You believed in understanding and second chances, in trying harder when things felt off. You saw their pain, their insecurity, their wounds, and you tried to meet them with compassion. But what you didn't see, at least not right away, was how that compassion was being used, how your empathy became a doorway for manipulation, how your willingness to understand became a reason for them not to change, how your strength slowly turned into a system that kept them steady while you were quietly being drained. And then something shifted. Maybe it didn't happen all at once. Maybe it came through small realizations. Moments where something didn't sit right anymore. Conversations that left you feeling more confused than connected. Patterns that kept repeating, no matter how much effort you put in. Or maybe it came through something deeper. A sense that you couldn't ignore anymore. A quiet inner voice that said, this isn't right. And that voice, that awareness, that pull toward truth is often where the lifting begins. Because being lifted doesn't always feel like flying at first. Sometimes it feels like losing your footing. Like questioning everything you once believed. Like standing in a space where the old explanations no longer make sense, but the new clarity hasn't fully settled in yet. And in that space, the narcissist often reacts because they can feel it. They may not understand it in the same way you do, but they sense the shift, the change in your energy. The way you're no longer responding the same way, the way their words don't land the way they used to. And that's when the resistance begins. They may try to pull you back in with charm, with affection, with promises that sound just convincing enough to make you pause. They may remind you of the good times, of the connection you once felt, of the version of them you kept hoping would stay. Or they may take a different route. They may become more critical, more distant, more dismissive, as if trying to shrink you back into the version of yourself that was easier to control. And this is where the test begins. Not a test of your worth, but a test of your awareness. Because when you are being lifted, everything that once held you down starts to feel different. The things you tolerated before begin to feel heavier. The patterns you once explained away begin to feel clearer. The emotional manipulation that once confused you begins to reveal itself for what it is. And with that clarity comes choice. Do you go back to what is familiar, or do you keep moving toward what is true? That choice is not always easy, because what is familiar, even when it is painful, can feel safer than the unknown. You know how to navigate it. You know the roles, the patterns, the unspoken rules. But what you are stepping into now requires something different. It requires trust, not just in something greater, but in yourself. Trust that what you are seeing is real. Trust that what you are feeling matters. Trust that the discomfort you feel in stepping away is not a sign that you are doing something wrong, but a sign that you are breaking out of something that no longer serves you. And as you begin to trust that, something remarkable happens. You stop reaching for their validation. You stop explaining yourself in circles, hoping they will finally understand. You stop trying to prove your worth to someone who benefits from keeping you uncertain of it. And in that space, the dynamic begins to shift, because the narcissist's sense of control was never built on your weakness. It was built on your participation, on your willingness to engage, to respond, to invest your energy into maintaining something that was never balanced. So when you begin to withdraw that energy, not in anger, not in revenge, but in clarity, they begin to feel the absence. And that absence creates instability for them. Because without your reassurance, your attention, your emotional labor, they are left with something they often struggle to face, themselves. And instead of turning inward with reflection, they often react outward, They may try harder to provoke you, to get a reaction, to pull you back into the cycle. They may question your character, your intentions, your decisions. They may attempt to rewrite the story in a way that positions you as the one who changed, the one who caused the distance, the one who is now a difficult or a different. But here's what's important to remember. You are different, and that difference is not something to apologize for. It is the result of growth. It is the result of seeing clearly what you could not see before. It is the result of being lifted out of a space where you were constantly adjusting yourself to fit into someone else's needs, someone else's expectations, someone else's version of reality. And now you are no longer willing to do that, not because you've become cold or distant, but because you've become aware. Aware of the cost of abandoning yourself, aware of the patterns that kept you stuck, aware of the truth that your worth was never meant to be negotiated in the first place. And as that awareness deepens, your connection to something greater, whether you call it faith, purpose, or simply truth, becomes stronger. You begin to feel guided, not by fear, but by clarity, not by obligation, but by alignment. And that alignment begins to shape your choices. You start to set boundaries, not to control them, but to protect yourself. You begin to step back, not to punish them, but to create space for your own growth. You start to speak less, not because you have nothing to say, but because you no longer feel the need to explain your truth to someone who has shown you they are not willing to hear it. And in that quiet strength, something shifts even more. You begin to feel a sense of peace that is not dependent on their behavior, a sense of grounding that does not change based on their mood, a sense of self that is no longer defined by how well you can maintain the relationship. And that is where the real transformation begins. Because when you are lifted into that space, the narcissist's influence begins to lose its power. Their words no longer carry the same weight. Their reactions no longer dictate your emotional state. Their presence no longer defines your sense of worth. And while they may still attempt to reach you, to influence you, to re-engage you in old patterns, you are no longer standing in the same place. You have moved, not just physically or emotionally, but internally. And that internal shift is something they cannot control. It is something they cannot take from you because it was never given by them in the first place. It came from a deeper place, a place that is rooted in truth, a place that is not shaken by manipulation or confusion, a place that reminds you again and again that you were never meant to stay small so someone else could feel big. You were never meant to carry the weight of someone else's inability to show up with honesty and accountability. You were never meant to lose yourself in the process of trying to keep something together that required you to break. And as you continue to rise into that understanding, you may begin to feel a mixture of emotions. Relief for finally seeing clearly. Grief for the time and energy that was lost. Anger for the ways you were treated. And even compassion for the person who could not meet you where you needed them to. All of those emotions can exist at the same time. They are part of the process, but they do not define your direction, because your direction now is forward, not back into confusion, not back into cycles that kept you questioning your worth, but forward into a space where your life is no longer centered around managing someone else's instability, a space where your energy is your own, your voice is your own, your identity is no longer shaped by how well you can adapt to someone else's dysfunction. And as you continue to walk in that direction, something becomes clearer and clearer. But the lifting was not about changing them. It was about freeing you from patterns that kept you stuck, freeing you from beliefs that kept you small, freeing you from the idea that you had to earn love by over-giving, over-explaining, and over-sacrificing. And in that freedom, you begin to experience something that may have felt distant for a long time. Wholeness. Wholeness. Not because everything is perfect, not because there are no more challenges, but because you are no longer divided within yourself. You are no longer ignoring your instincts to maintain peace. You are no longer silencing your truth to avoid conflict. You are no longer abandoning your needs to keep someone else comfortable. And that alignment, that integrity becomes your foundation. It becomes the place you return to when doubt tries to creep in, when old patterns try to resurface, when the pull of familiarity tries to convince you to go back. You remember what it felt like to be lost in that dynamic. You remember the confusion, the exhaustion, the constant questioning. And you recognize how different you feel now, more grounded, more aware, more connected to yourself in a way that does not require external validation to sustain. And in that awareness, you continue to rise. Not in a way that is loud or performative, but in a way that is steady, real, and deeply rooted in truth. And as you rise, the space you once occupied in their world begins to change, because you are no longer filling it in the same way. You are no longer feeding the system that kept them steady. You are no longer reinforcing the version of reality that centered them at your expense. And without that reinforcement, they are left to navigate something they have long avoided. A world where control is no longer guaranteed, where influence is no longer automatic, where the person they once relied on to maintain their sense of self is no longer available in the same way. And that is where their fall begins. Not necessarily in a way that you will witness directly, not always in a way that is visible or dramatic, but in the quiet unraveling of a dynamic that can no longer function as it once did. Because the foundation it relied on, you, has changed. And as that foundation shifts, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. But here's the part that matters most for you. Their fall is not your responsibility. It is not something you need to manage, soften, or prevent. Because your role was never to hold them up at the cost of yourself. Your role now is to continue standing in your truth, to continue honoring the clarity you've gained, to continue walking in a direction that reflects your growth, your awareness, and your worth. And as you do that, step by step, choice by choice, you begin to embody something that cannot be taken from you. A quiet strength, a grounded sense of self, a deep, unshakable knowing that you are no longer who you used to be. And that changes everything.